They dismissed her as the angel. They meant it as praise, but it wasn't. It was a label that kept her in a narrow place, gentle, grateful, temporary. An angel comforts. An angel appears and vanishes. An angel does not reorganize an army. Clara Barton did. She arrived on battlefields that swallowed men by the thousands and refused to play the role written for her. She did not pass bowls of broth and disappear behind a curtain of sentiment. She counted. She recorded. She requisitioned. She forced order onto places where order had been abandoned. She turned mercy into a system, and a system into survival. They dismissed her as the angel until Clara Barton rewrote battlefield medicine. She did not begin as a nurse. She began as a school teacher and a clerk in the U.S. Patent Office, one of the first women appointed to a full-time federal post. She was not trained in surgery or anatomy, but she understood something most armies in 1861 did not, that suffering multiplied when logistics failed. In April of that first war spring, Washington filled with regiments and rumor. Men in new uniforms stumbled off trains with nothing but haversacks and hope. They bled on the floors of federal buildings pressed into service as hospitals. She walked among them with a notebook and a question that would become her signature. "What do you need?" They told her the plain truth. Food before the wagons arrive, shirts when the ones they wore were cut away, bandages when the lint ran out, clean water, lanterns, soap, towels, safety pins, morphine if anyone could find it. She wrote it all down and went hunting for it in a city that barely knew what a quartermaster was supposed to do. She was not allowed to accompany the army at first. Regulations barred civilians from the front, and some officers barred women from their mines. She worked from Washington warehouses and church basements, gathering crates of supplies from citizens and strangers who sent everything they could spare. She packed the boxes herself and labeled them with a precision that would become her habit. She built a map in her head of regiments, depots, and railheads. She learned the schedules of trains and steamboats and the temper of clerks whose signatures could stall or speed everything. In the summer of 1862, she received official permission to bring supplies to the front. She did not ask for an escort. She hired wagons, loaded them to the rails, and moved. Cedar Mountain was waiting. The battle had ended days before, but the wounded were still there. Too many for the surgeons, too few hands to carry water, not enough light to work by. She arrived in Culpeper with what the men had asked for and what the system had failed to deliver. Lanterns first, then shirts, bread, sugar, whiskey, bandages. She peeled cloth from wounds that had dried like glue and spoke to men as if they were not disappearing. Someone called her an angel. The word stuck. She bit it back and kept moving. The name followed her to the next field and the next. Second Bull Run, South Mountain, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Charleston Harbor, Petersburg. The list lengthened, as did the wagons. She learned routes by heart. She learned which crossings held in rain and which bridges would collapse under a load of flour. She learned to pack boxes so that quick items sat on top, bandages, lint, tourniquets, and slower items below. Clean clothing, soap, the small luxuries that made a man feel human for an hour. She taught her helpers to stage supplies in rows that matched a surgeon's sequence, from pain relief to dressings to nourishment. At Antietam, the air shook with musketry from dawn until the light failed. 23,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day. She moved among them with sleeves rolled, passing bandages to exhausted surgeons, writing names in her notebook when a man could still whisper. A bullet cut through her sleeve and killed the soldier she was holding. She did not stop. She learned that night the lesson that would guide the rest of her life. Good intentions die without a plan. She was not inventing surgery. She was not commanding ambulances. Another officer, Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, was building that structure from the top down, creating the first organized ambulance corps, establishing field dressing stations, triage, mobile hospitals, and a discipline for moving the wounded from the line to safety. She worked from the other side, bottom up, meeting the system where it broke and knitting it closed with supplies, records, and persistence. Between the two efforts, a new model took shape, a battlefield where chaos still ruled but did not reign for long. Some officers resisted her presence. She answered with results. At Fairfax Station, she kept trains moving through the night, loading the worst cases first and keeping lists of names sent north so families could be told. On the Carolina coast, she nursed sailors burned by powder flashes and soldiers sick with fevers that ate regiments from the inside. When General Benjamin Butler placed her in charge of hospitals at the front of the Army of the James, she accepted without ceremony and set about doing what she always did, cataloging needs, placing supplies where they would be when they were needed, telling anyone who asked that the miracle was not in the touch, but in the timing. The war taught her that the most precious thing on a battlefield was not a hero's gesture. It was a clean shirt at the right hour, a lantern beside a table, a cup of water carried 20 steps to a man too weak to move. Mercy measured in minutes and in lists. After Appomattox, the armies went home, but the missing did not. Families wrote to the War Department and to anyone who had stood near a field hospital. "Do you know where he is? Has anyone seen him? Is there a list?" The questions piled as high as the correspondence crates in Washington corridors. She asked for permission to answer them. When none came, she found a way anyway. Her missing soldier's office occupied cramped rooms over a boarding house in the capital. She and a small staff opened letters, indexed names, and wrote replies until their hands ached. She sent circulars to newspapers across the country asking for information about men who had vanished into the war. She posted lists on walls and in train depots. She learned which clerks in which offices might share a ledger if asked with respect, and which would slam a door. She kept the same notebook habit she had in the field: names, units, dates, places last seen, hospital records, burial notes, anything. A web of facts slowly replaced rumor. In 1865, she accompanied an expedition to the prison at Andersonville, Georgia, where more than 13,000 Union soldiers had died. A former prisoner named Dorrance Atwater had smuggled out a copy of the death register. Grave numbers matched to names. Using his lists, the burial crews and clerks identified the dead row by row. She stood over ground that had swallowed the identities of men and helped pull their names back out. Families finally learned where their sons lay. She wrote letters no one else knew how to write. That work mattered to her more than any speech ever given about angels. She had gone to war carrying crates. She left it carrying records. The questions that had shaped her wartime work followed her into peace. How do you get aid to the right place on time? How do you protect the helpless when laws haven't yet imagined them? How do you build something that survives the hour of need? She found answers abroad. War flared in Europe in 1870. She crossed the Atlantic and volunteered under a new emblem, a red cross on a white field. The idea was simple and radical at once. A neutral organization protected by international agreement, permitted to relieve suffering on any side. She saw how it worked in practice. Warehouses prepositioned, local committees trained, supplies standardized, permissions negotiated before disaster. It was everything the early months of 1861 had not been. She brought the idea home. In 1881, she founded the American Red Cross, then spent the next year persuading a cautious government to join the Geneva Convention that recognized it. Her argument was not sentimental, it was practical. Wars would come again, and storms and epidemics, whether wars came or not. A nation prepared to help would suffer less and recover more quickly. She had watched what unpreparedness cost. She intended that the country not pay that bill again. She served as president of the organization for more than 2 decades. Floods, fires, famines, disasters that had no generals and no surrender ceremonies. She treated them as campaigns and built the habits to fight them: assessment, supply, distribution, records, accountability. The same quiet math of compassion she had learned in tents under canvas, she applied under roofs and skies of every kind. People continued to call her an angel. She let them, but the work she left behind had nothing to do with wings. It ran on schedules and lists, on prepositioned stores and volunteers drilled before the crisis. It ran on the belief that mercy improves with practice. She did not claim more than she had done. She did not claim medicine she had not practiced, or systems she had not invented. She spoke openly of the physicians who taught her and the officers who built the ambulance corps that made extraction possible when supplies were ready. She understood where her work fit and how it made the rest function better. She never asked for the last word. She asked for the next list. The men who had first dismissed her did not change their minds all at once. Change arrives the way she did, steadily. The surgeons remembered the lanterns. The quartermasters remembered the boxes that arrived before the request. The families remembered the letters that ended years of not knowing. The country remembered that someone had shown how to make feeling useful. She carried scars from the war that no camera recorded. Shells dropped on the roofs of field hospitals. Disease caught and recovered from in places where sickness had no manners. Exhaustion that cracked the voice when the day was over. And still, when newspapers asked for the lesson of her life, she wrote about organization. In private, she allowed herself one truth, that names mattered. The names in her notebooks, the names on headboards in new national cemeteries, the names in letters to mothers and wives who would otherwise have waited for a knock that never came. She believed that the opposite of lost was not found, but recorded. She died in 1912 in a small house near Washington. Before she went, she watched the organization she had built grow beyond her hands. She watched it outlive her, which is what she had intended all along. The legend remains, the angel who walked through smoke with bandages in her arms. The record is better. It shows a woman who refused to let kindness be random. It shows the red thread of logistics pulled straight through crisis after crisis until nothing hung loose. It shows a battlefield where the first mercy was a plan. She did not make war bearable. She made it less wasteful of life. She did not end sorrow. She shortened it. She did not change the heart of men. She gave those hearts tools. They called her an angel because they did not have another word ready. The word they were looking for was builder. She built systems where mourning had been. She built roots where rumors had been. She built a way of handling disaster that no longer required a miracle. At Antietam, the bullet that tore her sleeve reminded her that compassion is not a shield. Only practice is, only preparation, only the habit of asking what is needed, getting it where it must be, and writing down what was done so the next time there is less guessing and less grief. Others would carry the idea forward. Emergency medicine began to look like what she and her contemporaries had shaped in tents. Triage near the line, movement to care, records that followed the body instead of wandering away from it. Disaster relief began to look like what she had argued for: neutral, ready, fast, disciplined. The emblems and acronyms changed, the doctrine grew thicker, but the core remained: mercy that arrives on time. She never cared what they called her. She cared that the wagons rolled. She cared that the lists were legible. She cared that the last letter home carried a name spelled right. The army that once kept her at a distance eventually invited her stories into its schools. The nation that took years to ratify the convention she fought for now sends help in that emblem's name to storms and wars around the world. The field hospitals are cleaner, the stretchers arrive sooner, the families wait fewer months and sometimes fewer hours. The change is quiet and cumulative, and it looks a lot like her handwriting: small, neat, relentless. They dismissed her as the angel. It was easier than admitting the truth, that the war had needed a different kind of general, and that she had been one. When people ask when modern battlefield medicine began, they list innovations: the ambulance corps, the dressing stations, the triage categories, the operating tent, the evacuation chain. They are correct to cite the surgeon who drew the chart and the officers who ordered the wagons. But the practice that knits those parts together, the practice of asking, recording, delivering, and measuring, began each time she stepped off a wagon with a ledger under her arm. She did not carry a sword. She carried a pencil. The work of the American Red Cross that she founded runs on that pencil still. It signs agreements before disasters, not afterward. It counts inventory. It places supplies close to where they will be used. It trains neighbors to help neighbors. It belongs to no party and reports to every conscience. Wars will come again, and floods and fires. They always do. The argument she made for a lifetime still stands: that a nation's compassion can be organized, that relief can be as disciplined as attack, and that the worth of that discipline is measured in names returned to households and hours recovered from pain. They dismissed her as the angel until they realized that the miracle was a system. And once a system exists, it does not vanish when the lanterns go out. It remains like a warehouse key on a nail by the door, waiting for the next storm. It is not the glow of a story. It is the gravity of a plan. Clara Barton did what angels do not. She stayed, she counted, she built. She taught others to do the same. She made mercy routine. That is how battlefields become less cruel. Not by sentiment, but by structure. Not by spontaneous heroics, but by repeated competence. Not by wings, but by work. They dismissed her as the angel. They do not anymore. She was there before the system existed, and she stayed until it did. The early marches taught her everything the manuals did not. At the first skirmishes around the capital, she learned that wagons without priorities are just wooden boxes on wheels. At the peninsula, she learned that roads choose the army, not the other way around, and that a single washed-out bridge can turn a hospital empty while another drowns under work. At Cedar Mountain in August 1862, she learned what heat does to wounded men when water and shade run out. She did not write poems about it. She wrote lists. On the road to Second Bull Run, the dust lay thick enough to blind. Trains brought the wounded into makeshift depots faster than surgeons could see them. She walked the cars with a pencil behind her ear, marking which cots needed to move first, which would not move at all, which must be kept where they lay until the next surgeon rotated in from the operating tent. She learned to ignore the noise that tells a worker what is urgent and listen to the quiet that tells a planner what is important. Urgency is loud. Importance is patient. At South Mountain, the work shrank to inches. Men lay head to foot along stone walls, and everywhere the dirt was full of spent caps and torn cloth. She saved her voice for instructions that multiplied other people's hands. This one now, this one next, water here, morphine there, keep the lanterns where the table will be, not where it is. She had no rank, but she had a map in her head, and she redrew it every hour as the facts changed. Antietam fixed the pattern. She had arrived with wagons packed in the order a surgeon would use them. She kept bandage rolls open and ready, lint already torn, needles pre-threaded. She learned that the difference between a clean operation and a filthy one can be as small as how many towels an assistant can reach without taking a step. She noticed what the surgeons did not have time to notice, how men lying in the open shook less when their faces were washed, how a hand held for 30 seconds could steady breathing better than a shouted instruction could. She noticed, and she made those small mercies repeatable. Between battles, she refused to wait for orders. She rode the rail lines, hunted for food in towns that could spare it, and persuaded reluctant clerks to sign the papers that turned private donations into official cargo. She gathered women willing to work without thanks, and taught them the only rule that mattered: do the next necessary thing and write it down. She understood that records are the only way to make a kindness happen twice. At Fredericksburg, the river itself seemed to bleed. She crossed after the worst of it to find houses turned into operating rooms and streets into corridors of stretchers. She set up kitchens within reach of the wards so food would arrive warm, not cold and late. She put boys from the quartermaster's office on steady runs for firewood and water, and kept their routes clear so the staff stopped tripping over their own help. There is a kind of leadership that does not announce itself. It just removes friction until the work can move. In 1864, she went where the Army of the James needed a will more than a prayer. General Benjamin Butler gave her authority over certain hospitals. She answered by doing what she had done since the beginning, putting the right objects in the right places at the right times, and keeping score until the numbers told a better story. She cut waste without speeches. She argued only when a rule cost a life. When it did, she broke it and took the blame in writing. She did not confuse proximity to danger with usefulness. She knew that the busy place is not always the helpful place. When trains stacked up at a depot, she walked the line to learn which cars held men who could be moved and which held men who could not survive a jolt. When a surgeon shouted for something, she listened for the reason beneath the words and delivered the reason, not just the object. When the day ended without ending, she slept on the floor and kept the ledger under her arm so it would be there when the lamps were lit again. The men who distrusted her learned the way people do when they keep meeting the same result. They saw that the wagons she sent arrived before the storm broke, not after. They saw that her lists matched the counts in the morning. They saw that the letters she wrote to families made silence shorter. Results are an education that even pride receives. The end of the fighting did not end the work. The missing soldier's office began with one desk and grew into an address known in every state. Mothers wrote to her who had never seen a city. Soldiers wrote who had never learned to spell the names of the roads they marched on. Pastors wrote who held funerals for men who might still be breathing somewhere far away. She answered each one with the same attention she had once spent on a box of lint. She made the government's indifference burn up in the friction of her persistence. She kept a map with pins for prisons and hospitals and last known camps. She stood at the long table and read the same name in 3 different hands and understood that they were one man asking for home. She learned where clerks kept their duplicate ledgers and which quartermasters counted better than they wrote. She learned which chaplains tracked graves and which did not. She learned that a country can lose a war inside itself if it does not learn to account for the missing. When the Andersonville expedition began, the summer air was heavy enough to bend breathing. She watched as the burial party set to its work, row after row, stake after stake, name after name. Dorrance Atwater's clandestine copy of the register made the impossible ordinary. Match the number, find the line, fill the blank on the page and give a family a place to stand. She sent those pages north as if they were provisions on a battlefield, because they were, the only kind that mattered to people for whom the fighting had ended, but grief had not. She took no pleasure in the righteousness of it. She took satisfaction in the reduction of ignorance. She believed that the dead are safer when the living keep accurate books. By the time the last of the Andersonville names were posted, the war's emergency had become the nation's routine. She looked at what she had learned and accepted the obvious conclusion. Disaster is a constant, not a surprise. If help is to be more than luck, it must be organized when the sky is clear. She left to watch Europe fight itself and found in a Red Cross the method she had been inventing by instinct. She studied how committees kept their stores fresh and their volunteers trained. She studied how permissions were secured before they were needed. She studied how neutrality could be proven in practice so that suspicion did not stop the work at the border. She brought back a pattern and the discipline to fit a nation to it. The American Red Cross began in borrowed rooms. It learned to speak in receipts and manifests. It learned to be boring on purpose so that when it needed to be swift, it could be. She argued the case to a White House tired of arguments and won not with sentiment, but with her old ally, clarity. Join the Geneva Convention. Agree in writing to spare those who spare others. Let the emblems stand when flags cannot. The government signed in 1882, and the paper outlived every person who put pen to it. Between signatures and sealings, there was work. The Johnstown flood tore a city apart in 1889. She arrived with tents, blankets, clothing, tools, and people who already knew what they were supposed to do. They cooked for thousands and kept records no one else had time to keep. They built temporary shelters and made sure those shelters had registries so families could find each other without asking the same question twice. They left the town better organized than they found it, which is the only measure that matters after the news has moved on. The hurricanes of the 1890s and the turn of the century taught the same lesson in salt and wind. She sent teams to the Sea Islands and to Galveston with the mixture of stubbornness and humility that distinguishes useful aid. Bring enough to help. Bring only what is needed. Learn the place before you announce the plan. When the Spanish-American War came, she was an old woman who refused to act like one. She moved supplies to camps where disease was the enemy and taught again what the war had taught her, that prevention, not theater, saves the most lives. She was not always right. No planner is. She could be sharp when she thought excuses were being offered instead of reasons. She held the reins of the organization too tightly for too long and resigned late. But even her mistakes were the kind of errors that come from wanting a standard kept, not from indifference. She preferred the risk of being exacting to the certainty of being sentimental. She called what she had done ordinary work. Others called it a miracle because they had not seen the ledgers. A miracle is just a plan no one expected. What she changed is visible in the smallest details of modern care. The kit that is stocked before the season of storms, the shelf that is labeled before the first gurney arrives, the volunteer who knows their role before the room fills, the chart that moves with the patient instead of staying behind. Field medicine is still surgery and skill, bravery and luck, but it is also staging, sequence, and supply. That is what she insisted upon, that mercy be arranged. There is a picture of her in late life, slight and composed, a ledger open in front of her. People see the face. The lesson is in the book. She did not pretend to be what people named her. She accepted the name as long as it got the wagon through the checkpoint faster. She put the story to work. If calling her an angel opened a door, she walked through carrying a crate. If someone thanked her for a miracle, she handed them a list and a pencil and pointed at the next stack of boxes. When the century turned and machines remade the speed of news, she ignored the rush and kept the tempo steady. The right pace for relief is not fast or slow. It is on time. She died without heirs and left her records to the country. The country lost them and then found them again in rooms above a long-closed office where dust lay on the ledgers like a second binding. The pages still carry the weight of names. Anyone who has ever waited for a call after a disaster understands why she saved them. The habits she taught survived her. Ask, count, move, record, repeat. The organizations that learned those habits outlast arguments and fashions. They fail in small ways and correct themselves because the record forces correction. In that way, her work continues to have the quality her admirers saw in her presence. It steadies people. The battlefield medicine of today carries her fingerprints. Triage begins close to the wound so that time is not wasted deciding who to carry first. Evacuation follows a chain designed before the battle, not improvised under fire. Stockpiles of dressings, fluids, and instruments sit where they will be needed because someone thought about roads when the roads were empty. Surgeons rely on skill. They rely on logistics more. Both truths can live in one tent. If the story must have a single sentence, it is this: she turned compassion into a repeatable act. The rest is detail worth reading. She wrote it down so others would not have to guess. They dismissed her as the angel. They were wrong about the noun. They were right about the effect. She made help appear where no one expected it and stay long enough to matter. A nation that prepares is a nation that remembers. She spent her life making that memory practical. The country is better for it each time the sky darkens and the phone lines fill and trucks move, because someone, somewhere, still keeps a ledger by the door.